This is the BBC World Service, and on our website you can explore more of our programmes, from documentaries to science. Listen and download at any time by going to bbcworldservice.com. On air, online and on smartphones, this is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to Newhour from the BBC World Service. I'm John Donnison. Today, NATO says it's doubling the number of its battle groups deployed on its eastern flank following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We'll speak to the US ambassador to NATO.
The Russians have not been able to achieve their objectives, but we have seen the Russians begin to use some tactics that are very troubling.
One of President Putin's senior advisors has quit his post and left Russia, reportedly in objection to the war.
Concerning Russian establishment, it's a serious sign that everything is bad somewhere at the very top of this political pyramid.
We'll get an assessment from Moscow. Also, millions of girls in Afghanistan are left disappointed after the Taliban abruptly closes high schools just hours after they reopened for the first time in 7 months. Plus, the latest on the attack by Islamists in Somalia, which has left at least 8 people dead. That's all to come. First, the news.
Hello, this is the BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. NATO Secretary-General said the organisation will approve major increases in the forces deployed on its eastern flank at an emergency summit on Thursday on Ukraine. Jens Stoltenberg said 4 new battle groups will be sent to Eastern Europe, to Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania, to counter the threat from Russia. Mr. Stoltenberg also said NATO would agree more support for Ukraine against cyber attacks and non-conventional weapons. He said the Russian invasion made the changes inevitable.
We face a new reality for our security. So we must reset our deterrence and defense for the longer term.
President Biden is on his way to Brussels for the summit. He will also meet EU leaders. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said Vladimir Putin had not anticipated the speed and determination of Europe's response to the invasion of Ukraine. Officials in Ukraine say Russia has destroyed a key bridge over the Desna River, cutting off a vital route between the northern city of Chernihiv and the capital Kiev. The bridge had been crucial to getting aid supplies into the city and was also an important way out for civilians fleeing Russian shelling. On the outskirts of Kiev, there's been further heavy artillery fire. Its mayor said at least 1 person had been killed. But he also said Ukrainian forces had retaken more territory, including the town of Makariv and most of Irpin, both west of Kiev. The US said the Ukrainians were making gains. John Kirby is the Defense Department spokesman.
Ukrainians are going a bit more on the offense now. They have been defending very smartly, very nimbly, very creatively in places that they believe are the right places to defend. And we have seen them now in places, particularly in the south, near Kherson. They have tried to regain territory.
The head of the United Nations nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, has reiterated that it is urgent to send experts and equipment to Ukraine to help ensure the safety and security of its nuclear facilities and prevent the risk of an accident. Rafael Grossi said he remained gravely concerned about the situation and said he hoped to be able to conclude an agreed framework with both sides without delay, adding that the IAEA needed to act now. Russia says it is throwing out US diplomats in retaliation for Washington's early expulsion of 12 Russian representatives at the UN in New York. The Foreign Ministry in Moscow said it had summoned the US ambassador and declared the diplomats personae non gratae, but the number has not been publicized, nor the date by which they must leave. In early March, the US mission to the UN said 12 Russian diplomats were being ejected for spying. You listen to the World News from the BBC. The first woman to become US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, has died. She was 84. Here's Anthony Zerka.
She was an instrumental figure in forming U.S. foreign policy after the fall of the Soviet Union. She was in Bill Clinton's foreign policy team, first as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and then as the first woman Secretary of State from 1997 to 2001. She obviously was very involved in setting U.S. policy towards the former Soviet states. She was big on expanding NATO. She called for a robust but pragmatic U.S. foreign policy in places like Iraq and, of course, the U.S. military intervention in the Balkans.
The United Nations Secretary General has said the Taliban's decision to close girls' secondary schools in Afghanistan is profoundly disappointing. Stefan Dujarric is a UN spokesman.
The de facto authorities' failure to reopen school for girls above the 6th grade, despite repeated commitments, is deeply damaging for Afghanistan. The Secretary General urges the Taliban de facto authorities to open schools for all students without delay.
Students who'd returned to the classroom for the first time since the Taliban took power in Afghanistan 7 months ago were ordered home on Wednesday, leaving many girls in tears. A spokesman for the Taliban's education ministry told reporters that the schools would remain shut until a comprehensive and Islamic plan had been drawn up. The Nicaraguan ambassador has launched an extraordinary attack on his government at the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States. Arturia McField described the government of President Daniel Ortega and his influential wife, Rosario Murillo, as a dictatorship. He blamed the government for the deaths of hundreds of anti-government protesters 4 years ago and for widespread repression in Nicaragua. There has been no response. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to Newhour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from London with me, John Donison. And we start the programme in Ukraine. We're going to be speaking to the US ambassador to NATO in a moment, ahead of that emergency NATO summit in Brussels tomorrow. First, though, let's catch up with what's been happening on the ground in Ukraine. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, is in the capital, Kyiv, where there's been some heavy fighting in the suburbs.
Yes, and not just in the suburbs, reaching right into some of the northern neighbourhoods this morning as the city emerged from another 35-hour curfew. It was, I think, one of the noisiest mornings ever since this invasion began just short of a month ago. There was sustained Russian artillery fire as well as sustained small arm fire. We often heard in this city in the past few weeks a crackle of gunfire here or there, but it went on for about half an hour. And then later in the day, we heard what we thought, and it seems to have been confirmed, that Russia used for the first time in the battle here the Grad multiple rocket launcher systems, and the firings created quite a lot of damage in a Kyiv neighborhood. And yet, in the midst of this, against the backdrop of air raid sirens, the mayor of this city, Vitaly Klitschko, and his brother, Vladimir, both of them champion boxers, chose to hold a press conference in a beautiful park right underneath a statue of St. Michael, the patron saint, the protector of Kyiv, to give the message that 3 weeks ago, Russian forces wanted to encircle the city. And I have to say, 3 weeks ago, there was a sense of foreboding here in Kyiv. But he said they've taken back, they've not just held the line, that they had taken back Makariv, about 40 miles west of Kyiv, that they were almost in control of Irpin, which is a suburb to the northwest, where there's been incessant Russian shelling and intense battles for control of that area, a gateway to the capital. But I asked Vitaly Klitschko, though, even though they were making some gains, judging by the sound of artillery, they are getting closer.
The Russians tried to make a circle around Kyiv, but our soldiers destroyed the plans of Russians.
We hear the sounds that the explosions are coming closer into the heart. They're not in the outskirts now. They're close to the center.
The Russians bombing and make a rocket attack to the Kyiv. Also, not so far from the center of Kyiv. Also destroyed the buildings and the subway stations. They try to come, but I promise you, as mayor of Kyiv, as citizens, they never come to Kyiv.
They never come to Kiev. Well, we've also been hearing about Ukrainians pushing back in other parts of the country, but meanwhile the siege and bombardment of Mariupol continues.
Yes, it is extraordinary that the Ukrainians, which of course who have been the defender in this invasion, have now gone on the counterattack here, as I just mentioned, also in Kherson, the first area to fall. But spare a thought for Mariupol, which has suffered the worst of horrors in this war, which is saying a lot. Even President Zelensky, who tries to put a brave face on this invasion most days, talked about Mariupol as not existing anymore. And the survivors who have managed to escape talk about a living hell on earth, that their home no longer exists, their street has been obliterated, and Mariupol has been wiped from the face of the map. We understand that the fighting has now reached the center of the city, what is left of the city, that the Russian forces are also opening fire from the Sea of Azov. Mariupol is cursed by geography. It stands in the way of Russia securing a land corridor between the Crimean Peninsula and eastern Ukraine, both areas which it has held sway over since 2014.
And that was our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, who's in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Well, the leaders of NATO countries, as I mentioned, including President Biden, will gather in Brussels on Thursday for an emergency summit to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. Ahead of that meeting, NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said the organisation would give the go-ahead for increases in the number of forces deployed on its eastern flank, with 4 new battle groups to be sent to Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania. Ukraine, meanwhile, continues to call for more direct NATO support, including a no-fly zone. Well, I've been speaking to the US ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, who's in Brussels. What's her assessment of the situation on the ground right now?
Well, we've learned a lot, not just in the last couple of days, but in the last couple of weeks, and that is, first and foremost, the Russians have not been able to achieve their objectives. It was clear early on that they wanted to immediately encircle and capture Kyiv. That was one of their main aims, preferably within days. They have not been able to do that. And we've also learned a lot about the Ukrainian forces in their will to fight, the training that they have, the capabilities that they can bring to bear, their spirit. And so I think at this point, we are all hoping that the Ukrainians will prevail. I think they will. But this is still a very serious situation on the ground. And we have seen the Russians begin to use some tactics that are very troubling.
And if they use their full military might, I mean, the Ukrainians won't be able to sustain that resistance, will they?
Well, we don't know. I mean, we'll have to see what type of tactics they use going forward, but these indiscriminate attacks on civilians are absolutely atrocious and horrific. You know, getting back to what's happening in Brussels, I think it is important to have leaders meet in person tomorrow to think about what more we can do to apply pressure on Moscow to get them to stop this war, and also to figure out what more allies can do collectively to help Ukraine, both with legal assistance and humanitarian assistance.
And what more can NATO do?
There's a lot more that NATO can do. We're going to be talking tomorrow about force posture in Central and Eastern Europe to ensure that NATO allies have what they need to continue to feel safe and secure. We're going to be talking about adding 4 more battle groups to Southeastern Europe. But we're also going to be talking about sanctions and additional steps that we can take to apply that pressure on Moscow. And then we'll be looking at additional steps we can take for Ukrainian citizens, both those still inside Ukraine and those now coming into Europe.
Those 4 new NATO battle groups in Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria and Hungary, that all sounds like a relatively medium to long-term strengthening of NATO's position. And what is being offered in terms of immediate further military assistance to Ukraine itself?
I would actually put the battle group decision into the short-term force posture changes category. Those are steps that we'll start taking immediately. We're ramping up those battle groups. We've been assembling the forces from across the alliance to form those battle groups. What we'll do over the next couple of days is have the leaders talk about the medium and long-term posture of the alliance, depending on what happens in Ukraine. I mean, we saw the Russians move 30,000 troops into Belarus. Belarus borders a number of NATO allies. And of course, you have thousands of troops in Ukraine. And we don't know what the future holds in terms of that presence. But NATO will have to adapt accordingly. And there are a lot of important discussions that are ongoing here at NATO headquarters about what that force posture should look like going forward.
Isn't this strengthening a bit like shutting the stable door once the horse has bolted, though. It's all a bit too late, isn't it? It was needed before Christmas, sooner, as a deterrent.
I wouldn't describe it in that light. I think we're taking a number of real-time decisions that are helping both with deterrence and defense as it relates to the war in Ukraine.
Isn't the bottom line, though, that Russia knows that NATO countries will not use those troops because they don't want to get directly involved?
There is a consensus in the alliance that NATO does not need to get engaged, but there's also consensus in the alliance that we need to do everything we can to get more lethal support to the Ukrainian forces, particularly in the area of air defense.
Does NATO have any red lines for Russia in terms of how bad it would have to get for NATO to become directly involved? For example, if Russia were to use chemical or biological weapons or even nuclear weapons, would that be a red line?
What I'll say is that I think there is Allied consensus. Jens Stoltenberg went out to the podium today and said that there would be far-reaching consequences if Russia used CW. We have made it very clear to Russia that they would face consequences if they use those types of weapons, and we've warned them not to do that. We've also alerted both Ukrainians and our allies to the fact that Russia has a track record of using CW, and it could use CW, chemical weapons, or accusations about the use of chemical weapons by us or by the Ukrainians as a pretext to instigate additional attacks inside Ukraine. So we have tried to warn Ukraine about this, warn our allies, and obviously we're monitoring the situation very, very carefully.
But those consequences for Russia would be more sanctions.
I can't say specifically what the consequences would be.
But not military, was what I mean.
I can't say that. We should take President Biden at his word. When he says serious consequences, he means it.
You mentioned strengthening Ukraine's air defences. We've had many Ukrainians on Newshour on this programme over the last few weeks crying out for a no-fly zone, a NATO no-fly zone. We've heard the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, saying the same thing. What is the rationale for refusing that?
It would, in essence, require NATO jets, NATO forces to shoot down Russian planes. And I think right now, as I said a few minutes ago, our goal right now is to end this war. We do not want to widen the conflict.
President Zelensky has said Ukraine should accept it cannot become a member of NATO. That's a concession, really, to a key Russian demand. Would it not also be helpful in terms of getting a peace settlement if NATO itself ruled out membership for Ukraine too?
Ukraine has every right to determine its own path, but it is not NATO's role right now to tell Ukraine what to do. Instead, we are messaging to Ukraine and also to Moscow as well that the door remains open.
But that might not be very helpful in terms of getting a peace settlement to stop this war. If you're saying the door to NATO membership remains open, I mean, that is one of Russia's key demands, isn't it?
It is one of Russia's key demands, and it has been. It appeared in the treaties that they handed us some months ago, and we sent a response back. There were an array of subjects that we were willing to sit down and talk about European security more broadly, but on that question of enlargement, the NATO allies came together, and they are in agreement that they do not want to negotiate enlargement with Moscow, full stop.
And that was the United States Ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, who was in Brussels for that emergency NATO summit taking place on Thursday. And just a reminder that you can listen to Newshour whenever you like. We've got 2 editions a day. You can find the latest online at bbcworldservice.com. Better still, sign up for our free download. Just search for BBC Newshour podcast. And coming up on Newshour, a Russian analyst tells us that despite the resignation of a senior Kremlin advisor over the war, there's little chance of a palace coup against President Putin.
The elites live like on a submarine. Any kind of attempt to leave this submarine could be considered as betrayal. Those people can't create any kind of conspiracy. Fear is the main feeling among them. They are sanctioned, and they prefer to be with Putin until the end of the story.
Our main headlines this hour: the NATO chief says the alliance will double the number of battle groups deployed on its eastern flank at Thursday's emergency summit on the Ukraine war. Madeleine Albright, who served as America's first female Secretary of State, has died. She was 84. And the United Nations has expressed profound disappointment at the Taliban's decision to again close secondary schools to girls in Afghanistan. You're listening to Newshour from the BBC World Service, and we head to Afghanistan now. It's one of those stories that has fallen out of the Ukraine-dominated headlines over the past few weeks.